Now, take, for instance, how this begins to change. Take, for instance, the adventures of one young man named Joseph Miraglia to understand what begins to be different in the post-war. Now, Joseph Miraglia was a $73 a week clerk from the Lower East Side. And his experiences in the late 1950s illustrate both the limits and possibilities of a new kind of economy, a new economy in which credit cards and home mortgages and all those things are starting to come into being. And yet, it's important to realize that while things look similar in some ways, they are still very different than they are after 1970. Now, his experiences begin in September of 1959, when Joe happened to duck into a fancy New York restaurant where he spied a pile of travel and entertainment card applications for, quote, men of responsibility. And so he fills out the Hilton Hotel's carte blanche application, complete with his real salary, $73 a week. And to his surprise, he receives a card a few weeks later with a letter that told him, quote, "This card is your key to every luxury Hilton has to offer." And indeed, it was. He quickly became the largest fraud in U.S. history, putting us on a path towards the pleasures we have today. Yeah, he began with the Waldorf in Manhattan, this clerk. Then he hit Montreal, then Las Vegas, then Havana, before he finally ran out of steam. In 1 month of orgiastic spending, he ran up a $10,000 bill, that is in 1959 dollars, while entertaining him across 3 countries, 4 girlfriends, and 1 Cocker Spaniel. He even got a rhinestone collar for the Cocker Spaniel. He bought fur coats, he bought fine wines, dogs, meals, suits, and even silk shirts from the same tailor as Cary Grant. And with only the cash Miraglia won at the craps tables and some checks that he wrote, he lived, he said, like a millionaire's son. Like a millionaire's son. And when the police caught up with him, he simply said, quote, "I always wanted to see the world, and I like nice things." Now, what's interesting to me is while Joe could live the high life on his carte blanche cart, he couldn't live a normal life. And this is, for me, the very important difference with today. A traveling businessman with a carte blanche could eat in swank restaurants, he could buy his wife, or possibly his mistress, a fur coat in an affiliated shop, and maybe even get a suit from the neighborhood tailor. But he couldn't go to Woolworths. He couldn't buy groceries. And only places that catered to the expense account took American Express. And for everything else, there was cash. And yet, so while Joe could spend 10 grand to live like a millionaire, it would have been nearly impossible for him to spend 10 grand to live like a middle-class person, much less a working-class guy from the Lower East Side. And so the way we use credit cards today, paying for groceries, fast food, and coffee, were heralded as futuristic in the 1960s, a hallmark of a wonderful, cashless world of tomorrow. It was even considered sexy. Men who used credit cards, according to surveys at the time, were disproportionately affluent, urbane, and more likely to agree with statements like, quote, "I like to think I am a bit of a swinger." I know. Those who opposed credit cards, this moral sentiment, believed in the immorality of credit. That, quote, and other affiliated ideas like liquor is a curse on American life. A woman's place is in the home. And my personal favorite, quote, hippies should be drafted. And so it would be a distributed landscape of credit, where credit spread out into the world, where credit could eventually replace cash. But one of the reasons that this vision of the future seemed so impossible was because of the real technological and financial limits on where credit could be used, and the moral limits on where it should be used. Joe's story reflected those limits. Now, the story from Miraglia, he was actually let off, so don't worry. He got off pretty free. The judge evidently considered his actions to be youthful indiscretions. But like everything else with the post-war, it pretended things to come. It was a foundation for the development of practices that would only come into their own later on. Once you started using credit in this way, it was hard to stop. In 1984, Joseph Miraglia perpetrated what the New York Times called, quote, the largest credit card counterfeiting ring ever encountered in the New York metropolitan area. He did 1.5 years in federal prison. And of course, it still remains uncertain what his credit rating is today.